Hello, everybody, and welcome. It's wonderful to have everyone here with us for day 2 of the Smithsonian Education Online Conference Series with a focus on President Abraham Lincoln. We have an incredible day 2 lined up for you, and it starts right now with an amazing session called Mr. Lincoln's Air Force. I assure you, you're going to enjoy this, and we hope we'll hear from you during the session with your questions and comments, and we'll have a few questions for you. I'd also like to show you some pictures that came in overnight from some people out there in the field who are watching us. These folks are at the Durham Museum, and I'd like to do a shout out to all of them, and thanks. And we encourage all of you to send in pictures of how you're experiencing the Lincoln Conference or what you're doing with regards to celebrating the life and legacy of Abraham Lincoln in your area. So feel free to send those in or post links to your Flickr pages or whatnot right there on the discussion area of the website. We're going to start our session with Tom Crouch in just a moment, but I wanted to remind you that you can submit questions at any time by typing them in that box on the lower left corner of the screen. There's a small area where you can type in questions or comments, and we'll be pausing to take those questions throughout. If you need any technical assistance, you can write to my colleagues at help@learningtimes.net, and they'll be sure to assist you. By the way, we've posted all of the recordings from our day 1 sessions. They're on the conference sessions page. You'll see that the session login button that you use to get in to a live session has been grayed out and replaced with an archive access button. So you can click on that to watch the recordings of any of the sessions you've missed. We'll do the same for today's recordings as well. And don't forget, the virtual exhibit hall has a variety of resources from many Smithsonian museums and groups that are participating in the conference, and resources, links that are referenced during all of these live sessions can be found there. Also some great teaching activities, images, resources, galleries, virtual exhibits, you name it. So check those out as well. And I would like to make a very special thank you to the sponsors of the conference, the Smithsonian Education.org group here at the Smithsonian, and we're joining you from their headquarters right here off the mall in Washington, D.C., which is home to many, although not all, of the Smithsonian institutions. And it's amazing when you think about, we've gathered the places that celebrate our history, our culture, our society, our scientists, our artists, our politicians, our people in so many different ways, and we've put them close to just surrounding our seats of power here. And it suggests that I think what's most amazing about our culture is our history and our people, and that's what we're celebrating. In fact, we're celebrating one particular person in the form of Abraham Lincoln during this conference. And we're going to get started now, and I'm going to introduce Tom Crouch, who's Senior Curator, the Aeronautics Division at the National Air and Space Museum. And I have to say, we already received a few questions, including one person who noted, "The session begs the question," Lorraine writes, "how are Lincoln and aeronautics related?" Well, you've come to the right place. This is going to answer that question, and you won't be disappointed. Let me turn the floor over to Tom Crouch to talk about Mr. Lincoln's Air Force. Tom.
Thank you, Jonathan, very much. It's good to be here. I guess, coming from the National Air and Space Museum, most people don't think that we have much of a connection with Lincoln or with the 19th century. But in fact, the whole business of aerial reconnaissance really began during the Civil War, and Lincoln was intimately connected with it. You can see on the screen now a picture of one of the Civil War observation balloons, the Intrepid, being inflated. And you can see Mr. Lincoln, of course, and down below you can see Thaddeus, Sobieski, Constantine, Lowe, who was the founder and the head of the Union Balloon Corps. I guess one of the really neat things that I would like people to understand about the Civil War is just how important technology really was. I wonder if any of our participants out there have any thoughts on the way in which technology had an impact on the Civil War.
In fact, you can answer that question in the chat box on the left side of the screen, and I'm actually going to put the question up in a similar form there. What sort of inventions or in what way did science or technology shape the course of the Civil War? Anyone have any ideas? Feel free to post them on that lower left corner. And we're getting a lot of responses coming in already. Lincoln's use of the telegraph.
Right.
Medicine, perhaps?
And we're going to talk about the telegraph today, in fact, because it was connected to the balloons.
arms technology.
Go ahead here and give folks some ideas. Technology just had an incredible impact, in fact, on the war in terms of communications through everything from military railroads to the telegraph, which, again, we're going to talk about today, ironclad ships, rapid-fire guns, specific things like submarines, for example, and reconnaissance balloons, something we don't always think about in terms of the Civil War. One of the other things I always like to start with when we're talking about this is what balloons are and how they work. Balloons really come in two kinds. You can have hot air balloons or you can have gas balloons. The very first balloons ever flown, and you can see this one on the screen, November 21st, 1783, by the brothers Jacques and Etienne Montgolfier. And you can probably tell from their name, they were French brothers. And November 21st, 1783, is the day when they first flew the first two human beings. And you can see the human beings in the little gallery right down there. And immediately after that, a fellow named J.A.C. Charles flew the first gas balloon. Just a little bit before this time, chemists had begun to study the gases that make up the atmosphere. Prior to that time, everybody assumed that the air was just one gas. They didn't realize that it was made up of constituents. And once people began to discover the kinds of gases that made up the atmosphere, hydrogen popped out. Hydrogen is the lightest element in the periodic table. It's between 6 and 7 times lighter than ambient air. So if you fill a balloon with hydrogen, it's going to go up. Balloons actually fly because of the principle of buoyancy, which Archimedes announced way back in ancient times. And it simply says that if you have an object that weighs less than the amount of air it displaces, you can't have two kinds of matter in one place at one time. So when the balloon's there, it's taking the place of that amount of air. And when you have an object that weighs less than the amount of air that it displaces, we say that it's buoyant. It's going to float. And that's why balloons work, in fact.
By the way, we've asked people with regards to the J.A.C. Charles, what famous American was present at the launch of the J.A.C. Charles in 1783?
And they all have it right, I see, or most of them. It was indeed Benjamin Franklin. Although, I see someone down here, we also have John Jay's name, and we have John Quincy Adams' name. In fact, all of them were there when Jacques Charles flew his balloon on December 1st, 1783. He flew the balloon that you see on the screen from Paris. And of course, all of those folks, Franklin and John Jay, and the members of the Adams family, were in Paris negotiating the treaty that was going to bring an end to the American Revolution. So they were all there and saw the invention of the balloon and were very excited about it. John Quincy Adams was there with his mother and father, John and Abigail Adams, and he was only 16 that year and was more excited than almost anybody, with the possible exception of Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin is always famous for those quotations that he would spin out. And one of my favorites, in fact, has to do with the first little unmanned balloon that Jacques Charles flew a little earlier in 1783. Franklin had gone down to the launch site, and after the balloon had gone off and he was walking away, he heard someone say, "Well, that's fine and well, but what use is this thing?" And Franklin turned on the person and said, "Sir, what use is a newborn babe?" He was very excited by the balloon, as was everyone who was around at the time. The first balloon flights in America were actually tethered flights in which the balloon was held to the ground by a line, and we're going to talk more about that when we get to the Civil War. But the first free flight, when the balloon just flew away freely, took place, as you can see, on January 9th, 1793, from Philadelphia. And it was piloted by a fellow named Jean-Pierre Blanchard, who took his dog along, in fact, on the flight. And when he launched from Philadelphia that morning, President George Washington was there and, in fact, gave him a passport just in case he flew farther away than he intended. And the cabinet of the new American government, they were all there. So lots of excitement about balloons in this country as well. During the years leading up to the Civil War, ballooning was a really popular activity in this country. Mostly balloonists were sort of aerial showmen. You can see a poster for a flight that Charles Durant was going to make on the page here. And people like Charles Durant and others would crisscross the eastern United States, beginning from the spring to the fall, with their balloons, and they would make flights at county fairs and state fairs and 4th of July celebrations. People would buy tickets to watch them fly, and that's how these fellows made their living, sort of peripatetic, traveling aeronauts. And in fact, those are the fellows who are going to be really interested in helping in applying aeronautics to help their nation when the Civil War comes along in 1861. This image is of the Battle of Fair Oaks, one of the many Civil War battles where observation balloons were used. And this is a Currier and Ives print. The fellows who produced these prints that you could find in households all over the United States during the Civil War era. And up here in the corner, you can see a balloon.
And Tom, interesting, a few of our participants who are familiar with this litho have never noticed the balloon until you just pointed it out to them.
Probably not. Exactly. You really do have to look for it. In fact, what you discover when you start to look is that quite a few paintings and other sorts of images of the Civil War battles, actually during the first half of the war, have balloons sort of spotted in places where you really do have to look to see them. These three fellows, James Allen, John Wise, and John LaMountain, were among the first to come to Washington once Fort Sumter had been fired on and the war was underway, and suggest to the government that maybe balloons could be used effectively by the government. All of them had the same sort of notion. They weren't going to use balloons to fly over the enemy and bomb them or anything like that. Their notion was that you could use balloons for battlefield reconnaissance, for climbing up high and looking over the enemy lines to see where the troops were massing, where the artillery was, and that kind of thing. Actually, beginning as early as 1783, during the wars of the French Revolution in Europe, balloons had been used to do exactly that, to reconnoiter the enemy, to fly behind your own lines and see what you could see happening behind the enemy lines. So these three fellows came to Washington, and each one of them, in his own way, tried to talk the government into creating a balloon observation unit, and all of them failed. John LaMountain, the fellow on the right, was, other than Thaddeus Lowe, whom we're going to see in a minute, and his aeronauts, was the only other American balloonist who actually did operate under combat conditions for a while, very early in the war, from Fortress Monroe down at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula. This is a picture of Washington. Of course, when the Civil War begins and the federal government's headquartered in Washington, there's a problem. Virginia, one of the southern states where the capital of the Confederacy is eventually going to be is just south of Washington. And in fact, you could look over the Potomac River and see Confederate Virginia across there. And Maryland, to the north of the district, was a border state. No one was really sure which way they were going to go. Abraham Lincoln was working very hard to keep them into the Union. And this is where the balloonists all came. And you can see a picture of James Allen up here in the corner. In June of 1861, before any of the major battles, James Allen came to Washington with a Rhode Island unit and his balloon and made some flights about a mile behind the Capitol. You can see the U.S. Capitol building here, and if you look real closely up here, you can see where the mall is and where the Smithsonian Institution is. And this is an image that was printed in Harper's Weekly, one of the illustrated newspapers of the period, showing what it would have looked like had you been in that balloon basket along with James Allen.
It's interesting for many people, for most people, the idea of seeing the Earth from above is, at this time, only really the people who are in these balloons have that vantage point at this point, which is a very small number of people.
Exactly. And the whole notion of seeing things from above, from this different perspective, fascinated Americans in the 19th century. Every little town had to have its bird's eye view, just like this one of Washington, that showed them what their town would look like if only they could fly above it in a balloon and see what it looked like with all the houses laid out. There was sort of a minor industry in this country producing those bird's eye views for towns all over America. Well, these early balloonists, all of them failed to interest the government in using reconnaissance balloons for one reason or another. At the time of the Battle of Bull Run, for example, on July 21st, 1861, John Wise, whose picture you just saw, actually took a balloon out toward the battlefield in Manassas, Virginia, south of Washington, but the balloon got caught in the trees before they could get it to the battlefield, and he could hear the guns, but he never got close enough to actually make a reconnaissance and see what the Confederates were doing. And of course, the Federals lost the Battle of Bull Run. It was a catastrophe. All of the Union soldiers came running back to Washington. And after the battle, a Union officer came up to John Wise and said, "Well, Mr. Wise, the balloon part didn't go so well." And Wise's comment was, "Hey, the balloon part went about as well as the battle part did." Thaddeus Lowe comes to Washington once all of these guys have sort of tried and failed to interest the government. Lowe was a really interesting guy. He was born in New Hampshire. He was fascinated by science when he was a boy. And to make a long story short, by the late 1850s, Lowe had become a balloonist. He had acquired a balloon, and he was one of these guys who was traveling the country making balloon flights and charging admission. He was a little more ambitious than some of them were. This is just a picture of Lowe's very first balloon ascension. But by 1859, 1860, his ambition was really showing. He had decided that he wanted to fly a balloon all the way across the ocean, all the way across the Atlantic, from America to Europe. And this is an artist's representation of the balloon that he built to do that with, called, as you can see, the City of New York. And you can see underneath the balloon itself, he has a big cabin here to sort of get into when he's flying the balloon. And of course, since he's going to fly the ocean, underneath it, he has a steamboat here so that he can escape in the event that things don't go well. Lowe spent a considerable amount of time trying to raise the money to fly his balloon across the Atlantic, and he could never quite make it. So he took a step backwards. He actually wrote to Joseph Henry, who was the first secretary of the Smithsonian, and expressed his interest in the science of flight and asked for Henry's advice. And Joseph Henry said, what you should do is make a preliminary flight. So in April of 1861, Lowe flew 620 miles from Cincinnati to Unionville, South Carolina. We had a map, but it's not coming up for some reason. But if you look at this date, April 20, 1861, that's just at the time that the Confederates are firing on Fort Sumter and the Civil War is beginning. And of course, Lowe is flying from Cincinnati in the north to Unionville, South Carolina in the south. So when this Yankee from New Hampshire comes down on them, the South Carolinians all think he's a spy. He had a very long barometer, the kind of thing that he used to measure his altitude. And in those days, barometers were quite long and tall. And he had it slung over his back like a rifle. And they thought that's what it was, in fact. So Lowe was arrested and packed away to jail. And he had to talk his way out of that. And he was rearrested and just had a terrible time getting back to Cincinnati. But by the time he did get back, and it was clear that the war was underway, Lowe decided that he, too, was going to volunteer his services to the Union. And since he had talked to Joseph Henry here, again, about his interest in aeronautics and the science of meteorology and the air and so on, he wrote to Henry again. And he had friends in Cincinnati, influential folks, too, writing to Simon Cameron, who was the Secretary of War, and Secretary Henry, who kind of liked Lowe, became involved in supporting Lowe's desire to found a balloon corps. And through all of these contacts, Lowe was able to meet Abraham Lincoln, who hadn't been president, after all, very long at this time. One of the things I think that people forget about Lincoln sometimes is the fact that he was fascinated by technology. He was the only president to have earned the United States patent, and Harry Rubenstein, I saw, talked about this yesterday.
And we're asking people if they remember what that patent was.
Yeah.
And a lift for a boat, a way to get boats over sandbars, good. A device for lifting boats over shoals, you got it.
Someone was listening yesterday. That's exactly what it is. It's a device for lifting boats who are trapped on sandbars off the sandbar. And Lincoln was very proud of this invention. In later years, his oldest son, Robert Todd Lincoln, would recall long after his father's death that one of his warmest memories of his father was in the 1840s when Lincoln was in Congress, and the family had come from Illinois to visit their father here in Washington, and Lincoln took Robert down to the Patent Office building, which is now a Smithsonian Museum, to show him his patent model. And Robert always said in later years it really was one of the warmest memories he had of his father. His father was so proud, and he wanted him to see the model. And all of Lincoln's friends would talk about just how fascinated he really was by all kinds of new technology. So Lowe is here in June of 1861. The war has just begun, and on June 11th, Secretary Henry takes Lowe down to the White House, and Lincoln and Thaddeus Lowe meet for the very first time. And Lincoln is absolutely fascinated by Lowe's description of what he thinks the balloons could do in terms of military reconnaissance and that sort of thing. And in fact, Lowe it just absolutely has him fascinated. And the War Department gives the Smithsonian enough money for Lowe to do some demonstration flights in Washington. And ironically, those flights were made, at least some of them, right where my museum stands today, the National Air and Space Museum. In this picture, you can see the Columbian Armory, which is the building that was there in 1861 on the spot on the National Mall where the National Air and Space Museum is today. And this is just a picture. In fact, this happens to be the oldest picture that we know of anywhere of a balloon, the oldest photograph of a balloon. It's an ambrotype, a special kind of photograph, and you can see it being inflated, and the people down here working on inflating it. And this is just a map of the mall. You can see the Smithsonian Castle and the U.S. Capitol up here, and this is the spot where Lowe flew and where our museum, the National Air and Space Museum, is today. And here's an artist's rendition of what that might have looked like. You'll notice that Lowe's tied to the ground by this line. All of Thaddeus Lowe's reconnaissance flights during the Civil War, thousands of them, were tethered flights. He was always tied down to the ground, and they would let the balloon go up to 1,000 feet or so that he could get a good view of what was going on, but he was always tied to the ground. And on the occasion of these famous flights in Washington in June of 1861, he took up a telegraph operator, and in fact also the fellow who owned the telegraph company. And while they were up in the air, Lowe sent a telegram to the White House talking about the fact that he appreciated Mr. Lincoln's interest. And here he was way up in the air, and he could see a circle of almost 50 miles, and you could see Confederate camps and that kind of thing.
Tom, we think today about we get on an airplane and they tell us to turn our cell phones off, and then we're suddenly blocked off from the world. This is one of the first perhaps one of the first messages sent in flight.
We think that, in fact, it is the first message actually sent in flight. In fact, in his telegram to the president, Lowe, and here is that telegram as it was delivered, and the kind of portable instrument that he would have had up in the balloon for the telegrapher to use. And in his message to the president, Lowe actually says this is the first time that a telegram has ever been sent from up in the air. And here we go. The first dispatch ever telegraphed from an aerial station.
So the telegraph line actually traveled along the same line that was the tether.
They had the telegraph line wrapped around one of the balloon tether lines right down to the ground. And one of the things Lowe was doing, of course, was to demonstrate that you could link these new technologies into something very useful. You could link the ability to fly with the ability to communicate over long distances electronically. This is just a later photograph of Lowe showing what the balloon looked like at a much lower altitude than he was at when he was flying from the mall. Lowe, I think, thought that, the president's interested. After that flight, in fact, in June, they hauled the balloon down and walked it from the mall down to where the White House is, which is a pretty good walk. And Lincoln came out, and Lowe talked to him while he was still up in the basket. And then they hauled the balloon down, and Lowe went in, and he spent the night in the White House. Lincoln's secretaries, John Hay and Nicolay, were there with them for a while, and then they went to bed, and Lincoln and Lowe just continued to talk about the wonderful opportunity that this presented. And Lincoln truly was enthusiastic. He sent Lowe off to talk to General Winfield Scott, who was the commander of the Army at that point. And things just didn't go well. Winfield Scott, unlike Abraham Lincoln, wasn't that interested in this new technology anyway. And Lowe tells these very funny stories in his letters about going to see Scott 4 times, and he's always busy. Once he's taken a nap, and Lowe finally, in desperation, um, goes back to the White House. And President Lincoln, this is on July 25th, 1861. In fact, Lincoln actually called Lowe back to the White House to say, why isn't anything happening? Why don't I have a balloon corps yet? And July 25th, you can see on this note in Lincoln's handwriting, that's 4 days after the Battle of Bull Run was fought and lost. And again, there weren't any balloons there. John Wise couldn't get there. So Lincoln calls Lowe back and says, if we had had balloons at Bull Run, that might not have happened. What's going on here? And Lowe explained that he couldn't even get in to see the commanding general. And so Lincoln writes this note out for General Scott. And ultimately, when this doesn't even work, Lincoln takes Lowe by the hand and he walks him over to the War Department, to Scott's office, and with a smile on his face. I think Lincoln kind of got a kick out of how impatient Thaddeus Lowe was with the military apparatus. So kind of laughing gently, Lincoln walks him over, and ultimately Lincoln lays the foundation for his Air Force, if that's what you want to call it. Lowe begins flying through the summer and fall in the Washington area, basically, and once the Federals are across the river in Virginia, he does balloon observations all along the Union lines in Virginia, looking across the Potomac, a little farther north, and just spotting Confederate positions. He's testing out other kinds of communication as well. You can't, if you have a telegraph up in the balloon, and he did that a lot, still, it's not a very effective way to communicate with, say, artillery on the ground. So what he would take to doing was carrying white flags up so that he could signal to artillery on the ground. They would be shooting at a Confederate target that they couldn't actually see, and Lowe up high could see where they were shooting, and using his flags he could say, you're shoot left, shoot right, shoot long, shoot short, that kind of thing. And
we have a number of questions on this topic, really. One question was from Savan, who asked, were the balloons ever shot down themselves?
I have some pictures to show you a little later on, Stefan. They were certainly shot at a lot, but none of them was ever shot down. It was pretty hard to shoot at them. If the balloon's going up 1,000 feet, that's too high for small arms to shoot at you, or hit you anyway. And they couldn't elevate artillery high enough. They couldn't point them high enough to actually shoot at the balloon. So what happened was that when they were launching a balloon, sending it up, there would be a 300 to 500 foot area as they were going up where they were really vulnerable. But once they got above that, they tended to be okay.
One more quick question from Christopher. Did the enemy realize what the balloons were doing, and if so, were they even concerned if the Confederate soldiers knew what they were doing? They
were very concerned, and they did know what they were doing. This is before the days of heavy censorship. So Union newspapers, including the illustrated newspapers, were just full of stuff about the balloons. So the Confederates knew what was happening. And in fact, they began to try to fly their own balloons. Since the South was less industrially developed than the North was, and since there were fewer sort of experienced balloonists in the South, they had a much tougher time of it. But the South too began to operate balloons to counter this northern effort, but they were never as successful as Lowe was. By the fall of 1861, a lot of generals had actually flown with Lowe. General McClellan, who commanded the Army of the Potomac, flew with him. General Fitzjohn Porter. Lots of generals, and lower ranking officers who were going to become really well known. George Custer, for example, flew with the balloons. The Army tended to think that it was a good idea to send officers up in the balloons who would have a better idea of what they were looking at than maybe the civilian balloonists did. Lowe and his balloonists were all civilians. They were contractors, essentially, which was one of their problems. A lot of folks in the Army didn't fully trust them. And so a lot of times they flew with experienced officers, topographical engineers who could draw maps and that kind of thing. By the fall of 1861, Lowe had permission and the money from the federal government to expand his operation. The first balloon that you see here, the Enterprise, is the one that he had flown from Cincinnati to South Carolina and then brought to Washington, and it was the first one that he used operationally. And then the second balloon that he built was the Union, and then these balloons, Intrepid, Constitution, United States, Eagle, and Excelsior, followed. You can see they aren't quite the same size. There are some pretty good sized ones and some much smaller ones. And he did that because he thought there might be emergency situations where you had to get into the air really quickly. And you could inflate a smaller balloon faster than you could inflate a larger balloon. And they were marginally easier to move and that kind of thing. He hired aeronauts as well, and here are a list of some of the men who flew with the Lowe balloons, and pictures of two of them, Ebenezer Seaver and John Starkweather. It was an operation that was labor intensive. To operate the balloons in the field, you needed a pretty good sized ground crew, 20 to 30 soldiers. And here's a pretty typical in the field during the Peninsula Campaign in 1862 scene of the ground crew and the balloon just going up and that kind of thing. So it wasn't an easy operation. But the toughest thing of all was how to get the hydrogen to fill the balloons. Again, hot air balloons at that point in time were not very effective, not very efficient. If you were really going to do this, you really needed gas balloons. So what do you fill the balloon with? Well, when Lowe was here in Washington, he filled it with city gas. In those days, there was a big gas operation on the mall by the Columbian Armory, and he just got permission of the city, and he filled it up with city gas. At that point, American cities, larger ones, the streets were lit with gas that was generated and distributed, and homes as well ultimately were going to be lit with gas that was generated centrally and delivered. So if he was in a city, he could do that. He could use city gas, which was essentially coal gas. It was coal that had been burned in a special way so that it produced a gas that was light, only about half as light as hydrogen was, but still light enough to fly the balloon. But when you're out in a battle in the countryside, obviously you're not going to have city gas handy. So what Lowe had to do was to figure out how to get the gas.
And let's ask those participating today, because I know a lot of them have already asked you this question: where did the gas come from that was used to fill the balloon? So go ahead, we're asking you that question. Go ahead and type in your ideas into the chat box.
I wonder how many chemistry students we have out there, Jonathan, who may have generated hydrogen in their high school chemistry labs.
Let's find out. We have some people making some suggestions. Someone saying maybe hot water, heated metals. I'm not going to say the right answer yet. We're going to turn to Tom for that in a second. Yes, some kind of a chemical reaction. That's right. Anybody else? All right. You can keep offering your suggestions. We're going to give you a little bit of a hint. We're going to close in on the apparatus that was used to generate it. So this is where that chemical reaction that Candace mentioned is happening.
Well, these two big wagons that you see are the inflation wagons that Lowe designed. They were built here at the Washington Navy Yard down on the Anacostia River. They started out with normal Army wagons, and they built these big compartments in them. Inside these two big compartments are big copper tanks. And what they did was they would carry big glass jugs of sulfuric acid into the field and iron filings, and they would put the sulfuric acid and iron filings into the big tanks inside the wagon. And of course the chemical reaction would boil off hydrogen. When the hydrogen first came out of the tanks here, it had a lot of problems. It was very hot. This is a reaction that creates a lot of heat. And also, it was very acidic. Again, it was carrying acid particles with it in the gas. So what you had to do, here's a washer with water in it, and a sort of deacidifier that has lime water in it. And you bubble the gas through these two things to cool it down and deacidify it, so the acid doesn't burn holes in the balloons. The balloons themselves were made out of silk, layers of silk, and they were treated with a linseed oil solution on the outside, and they usually rubbed neatsfoot oil on the inside, which they got from sort of boiling cattle hooves, and that kind of protected the silk from the acid. But again, they had to go through this process to really calm things down. And so this is what they took into the field when the balloons went out with the Army.
That gives us an idea about why it might have taken 30 people to accompany a balloon. There have been a few questions about the people who actually operated it. Were there any particular special qualifications? Some of the children who are participating want to know.
None. There were no special qualifications. The aeronauts, whoever was with a particular balloon, would give them instruction, and the Army would simply order a particular company of men. You guys are assigned to the balloon. Do whatever they tell you, and that's basically the way it was done. So no special training, although some of the individuals who were assigned to the balloons became very fascinated by them. I love this picture. This is the mall. You can see in the background the Capitol, and the dome looks a little dark. That's because it isn't finished yet. That's just ironwork up there as they're building the dome. When the Civil War began, a lot of people in Congress had said, well, let's stop work on the dome. We'll use the iron and steel for weapons manufacturing and that kind of thing. And Lincoln's response was, oh, no. No, the dome of the Capitol is a symbol of the Union, and we're going to continue building the dome of the Capitol. And so this photograph was taken about where the National Air and Space Museum stands today, out on the middle of the mall.
Now, if you watch very carefully, watch this image very carefully, watch that Capitol dome. We're going to fast forward you to the future. Watch carefully. Hey, it's Tom, time traveler.
Don't I wish I could go back and see those inflation wagons?
Let's watch that again. So right where you're standing, you would have had those inflation wagons right behind you. Amazing shot, Tom. Thank you for taking that for us.
And of course, by the time the war was ended, the view that you had of the Capitol was just the Capitol as it is behind me. The dome was complete. The Union was saved, and the days of the war were over. There were other kinds of operations. They operated the balloons from aircraft carriers, believe it or not. Down at the Navy Yard, they took an old barge sort of thing, the George Washington Parke Custis, named after Parke Custis of Arlington, and they put inflation boxes, just like the wheeled wagons, here on the back to inflate it, and they could take the balloons up and down the Potomac, when the Potomac was the dividing line between the Union and the Confederacy. And this is one of those maps drawn by a Union officer, Major William Small, from what's now Charles County, Maryland, where the balloon's going up, and across the river, for anyone who knows the Northern Virginia area, is the Dumfries, Quantico area that he's looking at. And if you look, you can see where Small has marked artillery emplacements, Confederate camps, and the things that he saw when he was up in the balloon. Early on in 1861, as you get toward the end, Lowe's still operating in Northern Virginia. But in 1862, the Peninsula Campaign begins. For the first time, the Union Army is going to leave the neighborhood of Washington. It's going to travel all the way down the Potomac, down the Chesapeake, and back up. This little area of land is called the Peninsula, between the York and the James Rivers. And the plan is for this fellow, George B. McClellan, who's commanding the Army of the Potomac now, to take his troops by boat all the way down to the tip of the peninsula, and they're going to march up to this place, Richmond, which is the capital of the Confederacy. And the balloons went with them. I'm just going to slip through some slides since our time's running here. Some of the pictures of the balloon that I love best were done by a private named Robert Knox Sneeden, who was with the 40th New York, and who was a fine artist and a map maker. He was discovered, if you will, by a Union general named Samuel Heintzelman, who put this private on his staff to do maps and so on. And all during the Peninsula Campaign, Sneeden, who wound up at Andersonville Prison at the end of the war, but survived, painted these wonderful scenes of the balloons in action during the various battles on the peninsula. As the Union Army moved north along the peninsula, it fought a series of battles that are called the 7 Days Battles. And so that's where the balloons were operating as the Army marched toward Richmond. Arthur Lumley drew this illustration, and as my little note says, he was with the New York Illustrated News. It's kind of neat to think about how visual news was communicated during the Civil War. It was done with photography, as we've seen. It was done with printed pictures in newspapers and illustrated weekly newspapers, and of course it was done by artists like Robert Knox Sneeden. I'm just going to flip through some of these. We had the question about how dangerous it was to fly the balloons, and here we see a couple of modern illustrations, or just one, I guess, of the balloons under fire. And of course it was dangerous. Weather was a problem. Here's a picture of that company of soldiers who were assigned to this balloon, the Eagle, which was one of the smaller balloons, battling to keep it from flying away in a storm. Some of the balloons were actually very nicely decorated with pictures of General Washington or eagles. Down here, you can see actually a picture of the whole balloon train with the soldiers as they're marching. You can see the wagons in here, the inflation wagons, and this wagon just for equipment and that sort of thing. just a picture of Lowe aboard the Intrepid.
A little close-up of him there.
Lowe and his aeronauts flew all during the Peninsula Campaign in 1862. Here's Thaddeus Lowe sending a telegraph message. And again, this is one of the images from the illustrated newspapers. Here's the balloon, and Lowe's just come down, and he's sending a message.
In a way, they are the first embedded reporters of this kind.
Oh, they were.
That we see on...
Truly, you did have embedded reporters in the Civil War, and some of them traveled with the balloons. So, the Union Army never did make it all the way to Richmond. In that sense, the Peninsula Campaign was a failure. It's the campaign during which Robert E. Lee became the commander of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. But ultimately, the Union troops came all the way back down the peninsula and prepared to fight in other areas. The balloons continued to operate at the Battle of Fredericksburg, for example, and at the Battle of Chancellorsville in 1863. And that was really about the end of the story of the Union Balloon Corps. As the armies were moving north, the Confederates and the Union Army shadowing them, toward Gettysburg, ultimately, in 1863, the balloons couldn't move fast enough, and as a result, they were left behind at Harper's Ferry as the armies moved north, and it was effectively the operational end of the Union Balloon Corps. Lowe was sort of feeling put upon and ill-treated by the Army command at that point, and things just began to collapse. I think for a whole raft of reasons. In part because while lots of high-ranking officers had been in favor of the balloons and thought, in fact, they were a success, others had always had a problem with the balloons. Communication, in spite of how hard Lowe had worked to communicate well, was a problem too. If you're flying above a battle, and even if you have a telegraph key and you send the message to the ground, it's still hard to get your information to the commander out here who's actually fighting. So there were a lot of occasions in which Lowe saw things that would have helped, but there wasn't a really effective way to get it to the front line in time to make a real difference. But European observers who were with the Union Army were really impressed by this, and as a result, after the American Civil War, French, German, British armies all developed military balloon operations. And of course, the one thing that the Union Army Balloon Corps had shown more than anything else was the value of reconnaissance. Even today, military reconnaissance, knowing what the fellow on the other side of the lines is doing, is one of the most important intelligence tools. And today, of course, we use satellites and we used airplanes for many years, but this is where it all began.
Tom, and people are offering their sense as to the importance of reconnaissance today, as you just shared with us. How about if we take a few questions?
Sure.
And we're going to go as you noticed, we're going a couple minutes long. There's an incredibly strong interest in this topic, so let's we'll do some rapid fire quick questions. It'll be like a game show. Okay. Here's one of our quick questions. Did Lincoln himself ever go up in one of these balloons?
Lincoln never did go up in the balloons, and I've always been fascinated by that. On the day on June 18th, when they walked the balloon from the mall down to the White House, and Lincoln came out and Lowe was still up there, it would have been the easiest thing in the world for Lincoln to have flown, but he didn't. Part of the problem is that if you've noticed in some of the pictures, the basket that Lowe is standing in is only 2 or 3 feet tall. It doesn't even come to his waist. So flying in one of these things is, it's a little spooky.
Thank you. Here's another question from Donald. Do you have any of the balloons themselves at the Air and Space Museum? And other than photos, do you have any other balloon-related items?
We do. If you go to the website that's associated with this internet chat, you can see, for example, Thaddeus Lowe's binoculars, the binoculars that he used in the balloon. You can see that big barometer that convinced the Confederates in April of 1861 that he was an enemy spy. You can see the big, huge wooden valve of the Great Western balloon that we saw at the very beginning of the talk. You can see bits and pieces of the most famous of all the Confederate balloons, a balloon that Confederate General James Longstreet called the silk dress balloon because they made it out of bolts of dress silk. So it's figured silk, it's patterned silk. The Confederates called that balloon the Gazelle. And in fact, when it was in the air, it must have been very pretty indeed because it had all these patterns on it.
Here's another question. In terms of the Confederacy's use of balloons, what can you tell us about that?
As I said in the beginning, once the Confederates saw what the Union was beginning to do with balloons, they almost immediately tried to counter it with their own balloons. And they started out with very simple, in fact, the first Confederate balloon that we know about was a hot air balloon. And it was not much, as they say, to write home to mother about. It was pretty much a failure. But by the time of the Peninsula Campaign, the Confederates were operating the Gazelle, again, the silk dress balloon, which was quite an effective, efficient balloon, quite as good as Lowe's balloons, even a little more colorful perhaps. But even that balloon was captured fairly early on while it was being transported by water. So the Confederates were in there swinging, but their balloon operation wasn't as effective as Lowe's operation was.
Candace asks, how does ballooning today differ from the methods that were used in the 1860s?
We still do some gas ballooning today, but almost all balloons that you see are hot air balloons today. And modern hot air balloons, in fact, aren't all that old. While the very first balloon in 1783 was a hot air balloon, the kind that we have today with propane burners under pressure and that kind of thing, only began to appear in 1960. A fellow named Paul Edward Yost invented the modern hot air balloon that we use today. So they're quite different, really. The technology is different than the Civil War balloons were. People still fly gas balloons like the Civil War balloons, but they're much rarer than hot air balloons are.
In terms of the overall impact of balloons on the course of the Civil War, how would you, in a nutshell, describe? I know it's hard to... It
is hard to sum it up because the balloons could have had a much greater impact than, in fact, they did. And for a whole raft of reasons, some of which we talked about. The difficulty of communicating information in real time, sort of the distrust of some officers with the new technology, the difficulty that Lowe had administratively, this civilian trying to interface with the military infrastructure, all of those kinds of things tended to limit the success of the balloons during the Civil War. But you have to remember, I kind of jokingly called this program Mr. Lincoln's Air Force. And it really was, in the sense that modern air power really does begin with these balloons. As I said, after the American Civil War, the European governments, the British, the French, the Germans, the Russians, all instituted military balloon corps of one kind or another. And as you get into the early 20th century, aeronautical experimentation in Europe, heavier than airplanes, in other words, are being experimented with by these facilities that began as military balloon facilities. Maybe some of our listeners have heard of Farnborough in Great Britain, which is a great English research and development aeronautical site today. Originally, it was called the balloon farm because it began as a military balloon operation. So, and again, the whole notion of reconnaissance and the beginning of the recognition of just how valuable aerial reconnaissance might be all begins right here.
Tom, I know I speak for everyone who's in the session today to say that this has just been extremely intriguing, fascinating, and I think it will affect a lot of people's not only understanding of the war and of Lincoln's interest in science, but for those of us here in D.C., it also changes the way we look at the mall and where you were standing. But really, a truly fascinating talk. I think for anything where you kind of wonder, is there a science angle to a story? This is a perfect example and a fascinating story.
Well, as I said, people don't expect to find Lincoln in the Civil War at the National Air and Space Museum. But again, we have those objects on display.
Well, we thank you, Tom, and thanks to everyone for participating. We now have a 2-hour break, and it will be followed by another wonderful session you won't want to miss. This one is from Shannon Thomas Parrish, who is from the National Museum of American History, and she'll be talking about public and private photography. And there's some amazing photographs you'll want to see that she'll be sharing with us. So tune back in about 2 hours from now in the same exact spot, and we'll see you all soon. Don't forget, you can continue this dialogue, and we hope you do, in the discussions area of the online website. So go ahead, post your reflections on today's session, whether you are a teacher who's joining us or you are a group of students, and we have some museum educators logged in from around the world as well. We want to hear your ideas, your questions, your lesson suggestions. So go to the discussion area and continue posting there. There's also a wonderful collection of resources on ballooning. There's a video clip of Tom and a nice welcome audio message and several links out to some artifacts on the Air and Space Museum in the virtual exhibit hall. So start there, and that'll lead you the way to some fantastic air and space related resources. We'll see you in 2 hours for the next session. Thanks, everyone.